All right, folks, welcome back to the FITSNews studio for another edition of Your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, the owner, founding editor of FITSNews.com, your host for the show. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We have got a jam-packed episode this week. First, Jen Wood and I are going to sit down and update you on the latest regarding 3 true crime sagas that we have been covering extensively on our website. I'm also going to be joined by our Andy Fancher for his latest Badge Gone Bad on corrupt law enforcement here in the Palmetto State. Last but not least, Dylan Nolan and I are going to break down a battle royale at the South Carolina State House between some entrenched special interests fighting over the issue of lawsuit reform. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. All right, so our first big block today covering true crime, particularly several of the high-profile sagas that have dominated coverage here on FITSNews.com for the last few months. I am joined by Jen Wood, our research director, who has played such a key role in covering all of these stories, Jen. And we're going to start with the Rose Petal murder. We covered this trial up in Greenville, South Carolina, extensively last month. You were there for the full 2 weeks of the trial. Saw a lot of things in that trial, didn't we?
Yeah, that was easily the wildest trial I have ever watched. I mean, easily, hands down.
Because it's such a complicated story.
It was complicated. There were a lot of legal issues that I thought were fascinating that came up during trial. The lawyers were top tier. They did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, both sides, the prosecutors and the attorneys defending Zach Hughes, who we're going to get to in just a minute. But just to pull the camera back, we'll zoom out 30,000 feet. This is the murder trial of Zach Hughes, a 31-year-old concert pianist accused of, now convicted of, the savage murder of Christina Parcell, a vet tech from Greer, South Carolina. Now, this seemed open and shut as the trial approached, but there were allegations against the victim in this case, and that's what made it such a kind of off-kilter story to cover, because all of a sudden this person that everyone was so sympathetic for, the initial news coverage, all of her friends and employers were talking about what a great person she was. Well, we found out during the course of the investigation that wasn't entirely true. In fact, there were credible allegations and evidence uncovered that she was engaged in the abuse of her minor daughter, not just photographs of a sexually explicit nature, but actual abuse, if what those filings claim are true. So that threw this case in a whole new light. And the key issue, Jen, became whether or not that evidence implicating the victim in this horrific behavior, whether or not it would be introduced, whether the jury would see it. And you did an incredible story just a couple weeks ago about the jury being pissed off at the end of the trial after it wasn't introduced. Tell us a little bit about this whole dynamic and the evidence, the jury.
It was interesting because during the entire trial, the press corps, as we were sitting there, were like, they must be Googling this. Like, how could you not? Because there was, very clearly something they didn't know about this case. I mean, they knew they didn't know something. And I think human nature, to me,
You wouldn't have been able to help yourself.
I don't think I could have helped myself. But when I spoke to one of the alternate jurors afterwards, he said, no, they truly stuck to the judge's instructions not to, read any press on this, not to look up anything on this. And I was pleasantly surprised. It was, and the jury pool itself was extremely diverse. It was split right down the middle, African Americans, whites, male, female. It was a really interesting jury. So I was really excited to talk to this juror. But yeah, after the trial ended and they handed down their guilty verdict, took them, I think, about a little over 2 hours, they found out about the allegations against Christina Parcell, and they were shocked and not happy.
Yeah, they felt like they hadn't been given the full story. And Zach Hughes, in taking the stand and testifying in his own defense, obviously felt like he wasn't able to tell the whole story. I went up to Greenville earlier this week, Jen, and sat down with Zach Hughes' 2 attorneys, Mark Moyer and Andy Mormon, both of whom, as you acknowledged, did an amazing job defending Zach Hughes in an incredibly difficult set of circumstances arrayed against them, to say the least. But as we look at this case and that decision for him to take the stand, before we cut to this clip, I wanted to ask you, were you surprised Zach took the stand?
I think I was. Yeah, I'm trying to think about when I actually found out that he was taking the stand. It was the day that you and Dylan were in court, and I was over covering another court case in Anderson, and Judge Fant read him his rights as it came to him taking the stand in his own defense. I think I was shocked.
Not just his rights, but the warnings of what can
Right, you're
happen
like,
when you
"What
do
could
that.
happen?" Yeah, everything, the implications, consequences. Yeah, I think I was shocked, and, I've covered 2 big trials since working for Fitz, and both of those trials, the defendant took the stand, which is so unusual and fascinating.
And it doesn't seem in either case to have helped.
Right.
But, well, I put that question to Zach Hughes' attorneys, and let's see what they had to say about that. Here's an excerpt from my interview with Mark Moyer and Andy Mormon. Let's take a look.
Well, Will, as you heard my opening statement, I stated that Zach has been waiting a long time, 3 years, to get in front of that jury and to tell what happened. Obviously, we can't go into the back and forth that we had with Zach, attorney-client privilege, but Zach wanted to tell the truth. And as lawyers, you're your client's agent. And so when it came down to it, at the end of the day, he wanted to get in front of that jury and tell the truth, to tell what exactly happened and why it happened.
He wasn't able to, though, in a lot of circumstances. In fact, I think one of the things he said that was also very compelling was, Your Honor, I've sworn an oath to tell the truth. You're not letting me do that.
He said that. The one of the components to this I think is overlooked, and I do think it's very important, is that on Tuesday when we began our case, the trial court indicated that we would not be allowed to assert a defense of others' defense. And that we were very aggressive in the way we litigated that. But up until Thursday morning, the last day of trial, when Zach had completed his direct examination, there was still an element of the law that would have allowed the jury, we believe, to account for why Zach did it. And specifically, one of the things we argued was that the definition of malice, there are many definitions, but one of the definitions is the intentional doing of a wrongful act without just cause or excuse. And so if you notice in Mark's opening statement, just cause or excuse was what he said, which was still viable under the concept of malice, even though we had lost the defense of others concept. So even with just a few hours before closing arguments, that was language we believed would remain in the jury instruction. We believe that was black letter law. And so I think that's very important. I think one perception is that, well, the trial court ruled that we weren't going to get into the defense of others. So you sort of, why continue this concept of just cause or trying to explain? And again, one thing that's overlooked is up until about 2 hours, the last day of trial, 2 hours before the closing arguments, the jury could have considered that idea in the concept or in the context of malice. And so up until almost the very end, and the trial court disagreed and amended the definition of malice to remove that language over our objection, but he removed just cause or excuse. But up until the very end, it was evolving.
Jen, so at the end there, we're talking about this appeals process and some of the grounds for this appeal. I mean, let me ask you this. We talked a lot about Alec Murdaugh's appeal and how he has some really legitimate grounds, if not at the state level, certainly at the federal level, as his appeal of his convictions moves forward. Let's talk about Zach Hughes' appeal. I'm going to ask it to you this way. Do you think his grounds for appeal, potentially based on not only the evidence that was excluded, but the avenues of defense that were closed off to him, do you think his appeal is perhaps even more substantive than Alec Murdaugh's, or how would you rate it in comparison?
I think probably just as, but maybe not more. There are some very compelling issues that I think an appellate attorney is going to raise in the appeal, and I'm anxious to read through it. I think it's going to be fascinating. And here's the one thing I think we forget often in this case is at the time that Zach Hughes murdered Christina Parcell, they did not know. There was no evidence of that sexual abuse. That all came out in the course of the investigation into the murder.
Right.
As they were investigating the murder. So I do think that is going to play into, any decision made at a higher court level. It'll be an interesting appeal.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was very interesting that from the conversation I had with Mark and Andy, I pointedly asked them how someone like Zach Hughes, that intelligent, that talented, uh, giving and caring, according to their take on him, how someone like that could be manipulated by someone like John Mello, the co-conspirator in this crime, according to Zach Hughes' own testimony, the guy who offered him money to commit this savage murder. They were under the impression that he was not manipulated, that he legitimately felt he was doing this to save a young girl from sexual abuse. And on that subject, you've got a clip you found from one of our good friends.
Yes.
Talk us through this.
Yes. So Ali Benevento from Strom Law Firm, who's one of my favorite attorneys, she's got a new TikTok account, by the way. You should follow it.
And Instagram
Yeah. And
for the old people.
but she did a video on the Menendez case, Eric and Lyle Menendez in California, who were convicted of murdering their parents. And they are, there's many appeals going on in that because they are claiming that they were sexually abused and it was self-defense. And she was talking about that and, this law of self-defense and kind of relating that to the rose petal case. I thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, let's take a listen here. Ali Benevento from Strom Law Firm weighing in on the Menendez case and its connection to the Rose Petal murder. Let's listen.
There has been more Menendez madness, two things. So first being that the governor of the state of California, Gavin Newsom, has ordered that state's parole board to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of the brothers that we believe Governor Newsom may rely on in making his decision about whether to grant their petition for clemency. Number two, Roy Rossello, who, as you will recall, is that Menudo band member who came out recently after the streaming series dropped and said that Jose Menendez was his sexual abuser as well. Mr. Rossello is digging in. He is saying, I was there. My abuse was real. It happened. And he wants the world to know it. Now, in the meantime, the new district attorney is saying, listen, I'm very sorry for all of you, but none of this matters. The analysis about whether somebody was sexually abused does not matter to the self-defense analysis in this case. It's not relevant. Is the issue of sexual abuse relevant to the analysis of self-defense? I practice law in the state of South Carolina. Self-defense is a legal doctrine that allows a person to use reasonable force to protect himself from harm. But there are a few caveats, including that force has to be proportional. The person cannot bring about the difficulty, or in other words, you can't start it. The question becomes, were the brothers acting with reasonable force to protect themselves against sexual abuse? Well, is blowing their parents' brains out proportional? Reasonable? The district attorney says no, it's not, and it's totally irrelevant to the issue of self-defense. It's not self-defense at all. If any of you have been following what was dubbed the Rose Petal murder case, where a man by the name of Zachary Hughes was accused of murdering a woman named Christina Parcell. Now, interestingly, in that case, Zachary Hughes actually admitted to killing Christina Parcell, but he said that he did it to protect Christina Parcell's minor daughter. He claims that Christina was sexually abusing, exploiting, and trafficking her young daughter, and that he killed her in order to protect the child. Now, in that case, Circuit Court Judge Patrick Fant said, I will not allow any evidence or testimony regarding sexual abuse of the child in the murder case of Zachary Hughes. Zachary Hughes was found guilty of murder in that case. I'm sure he will be filing an appeal, and I feel fairly confident that one of the issues on appeal will be whether it was proper for the judge to exclude evidence of sexual abuse of the child that Mr. Hughes argued was justification for him to kill Christina Parcell. The Menendez brothers' petition for a new trial, however, is based on after-discovered evidence, all of which surrounds this issue of sexual abuse. So if they are granted a new trial, and if that evidence is put forward in front of a new jury, it will be very interesting to see if the Menendez brothers fare better than Mr. Zachary Hughes did in South Carolina.
All right, so Jim, we hear this take from Allie, and again, much love for her. She raises some great issues.
Mhm.
Let me ask you this question, though. You reported yourself that the jury's deliberation, at the very end, it came down to the savagery of this crime.
Yeah.
It came down to one of the jurors literally reenacting all 35 stab wounds that were inflicted upon the victim, literally reenacting that, hitting on that jury conference table 35 times to really drive this home. Let me ask you this way, and we've talked about it here in the office. Dylan Nolan, we're gonna have him on the show later in our political segment, but he was covering this trial too. He made the point, if this guy had fired one gunshot and killed Christina Parcell, this outcome may have been very different. Do you believe that? Do you?
Absolutely. That's the juror I spoke with said it would have been a different outcome, in his view. I mean, he wasn't a deliberating juror, but he said, in their conversation, that the savagery of that murder impacted them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think, like Allie said, proportional. The kind of, I mean, that 35, that is a lot to the head and neck area. That is just
Yeah.
brutal.
And you and Dylan were there for the whole 2 weeks. I was only up there one day of the trial, but the day I was there, I remember the testimony of the forensic pathologist, Dr. Claire Rose. Believe it Rose or Rosen?
I think it's Rose.
Her testimony about those wounds. She was so calm, so dispassionate, so scientific about it. But the description of those wounds, the severing of the jugular, of the carotid, it was just, it shook you to hear that testimony.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, we've got some other cases we need to dive into, Jen. I want to ask you about the latest developments in a story that broke exclusively here on FITSNews back in early May of last year. We were the first media outlet in the country to report on the death of Micah Miller, the aspiring missionary worship leader from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She was the wife of John Paul Miller, the pastor of Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Her death has opened numerous floodgates, Jen. We're talking about criminal investigation, including a federal inquiry of John Paul Miller. Again, we don't know exactly what it's related to. A legislative push for reform of the state's domestic violence laws related to the alleged coercive control that he was exerting over Micah Miller in the days, weeks before her death. But it has been a whole saga. But there have been a number of legal moves in the last few months. John Paul Miller, for his part, seeking to reclaim the narrative, has filed a ton of lawsuits in magistrate court against his critics and others. But more recently in circuit court in Horry County, 2 major lawsuits filed by Jane Does against not only John Paul Miller, but his father, Pastor Reginald Wayne Miller, another one of these fallen pastors whose religious empire, according to these lawsuits, was a front for abuse. You have read these complaints, Jen. They're filed by some serious lawyers, Randall Hood, Mark Tinsley, who we know very well, serious guys. These lawsuits are beyond graphic. They are beyond triggering, I guess is the word Callie Lyons used in cover. Walk us through these cases and what do they mean for the John Paul Miller saga moving forward?
So the Jane Doe 2 lawsuit that was filed this week was particularly, for me, hard to read. It was just a difficult fact pattern. She went to one of Wayne Miller's schools in the 90s. She was 16 years old. And, the abuse she suffered while she was there, allegedly, in this lawsuit was shocking. She's, at one point, John Paul, who was 19 years old and teaching there, so, as the lawsuit claimed, that they hired teachers with no educational background, no credentials, no certifications. And John Paul was one of those teachers. And according to the lawsuit, he sexually assaulted her. She reported it to Wayne Miller, who at that time was the head of the school. And Wayne Miller basically punished her for reporting it, made her write 5,000 times, "I will not lie about John Paul Miller." And then in the months that followed, she suffered abuse at the hands of her classmates who were told about this report. The abuse was, held her down and sprayed bug spray in her eyes, allegedly. Just terrorized this young woman. She was 16. And then there was one part in the lawsuit where she had a Harry Potter book. All of our kids love Harry Potter.
Kids were in their Harry Potter jammers this morning. All of them have got the Harry Potter jammers.
I'm pretty sure mine's got a wand in his backpack out there. So it had a Harry Potter book, and they told her, found out about it, told her she would be, I believe, let me look at my notes. Make sure I get this one right, because
They beat her with a Bible, didn't they?
Yeah, if she continued down this path, she would be raped by demons. They then set the book on fire and then beat her with the Bible and poured water over her head.
Wow.
And I mean, if what's being claimed in these lawsuits is true, they're claiming that Wayne Miller, and following Wayne Miller, because John Paul followed in his father's footsteps, set up these churches and schools as a way to have access to children.
Yeah.
And it's just sad. It's scary. As a parent, it made me sad reading that one.
Yeah. Well, both of these lawsuits are explosive, and Randall Hood, by the way, one of the lawyers
Not
on
one
both
I'd
of these
want
cases. Yeah,
to be going against.
He's integrally involved in another major religious empire scandal up in Fort Mill, South Carolina, the Morning Star Ministries Church. Callie Lyons in our office has written a number of stories about that scandal as well. Similar allegations, similar alleged culture of cover-up from these religious institutions. And in fact, in that case, the ministry attempted to invoke this ecclesiastical doctrine defense, basically saying that the church in those instances is above the law. South Carolina Circuit Court having none of that at this point. But those cases are moving forward up in the 16th Circuit. And we've got these in the 15th Circuit, in addition to all the other investigations into John Paul Miller. And Jen, our investigations into this guy are ongoing. We have been following the money. You found some very interesting connections with regard not just to the church and corporations that John Paul Miller has created, but some very interesting ties to some unsavory folks. We're not going to get too deep into that today, but our work continues on this case.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's a deep dive. And, as I've always said, if you want to know where the crime is, you look into business records, property records, financials.
Absolutely. And once again, a ton of people on this case. We were the first to report it. We were driving the story, continue to drive it, but a lot of folks covering this. The more the merrier. The more light and attention we get on this, the closer we're going to get to the truth. Jen, as we close out our true crime segment, you did another story this week on the Murdaugh saga. We mentioned it earlier in connection with the Rose Petal case and the appeals process. But the Murdaugh multiverse, you called it, is this array of documentaries, books, movies. Now we've got a screenplay coming out from one of the lawyers at the heart of it. He's going to be doing a reading actually today, Saturday, here in Columbia, South Carolina. Joe McCulloch, walk us through this latest Murdaugh multiverse development.
I was Joe McCulloch. During the trial, I found him to be like when I had questions, legal questions. I think he teaches at USC Law, so I think he's a teacher at heart. But I found him very interesting and very engaging. Always happy to answer questions. So I was excited to see that he's writing something, and given the saturation of content that we're seeing. I was excited that it's a little different, a screenplay. So many things you could do with a screenplay, and it is really, a Southern Gothic drama. I mean, there are things in the story that are still just absolutely unbelievable.
And unresolved.
And so many loose ends. So I was really excited to see that he had been working on something, and looking forward to see where that goes. Plus, his firsthand knowledge of the case, I think, he was involved in the boat crash lawsuits as representing Connor Cook, one of the individuals who was on the boat the night it crashed.
And also represents the juror at the heart of the big conspiracy. That's one of those
Yes.
loose ends. He represents the egg juror, Myra
Right.
Crosby, who has claimed that there was a conspiracy to oust her from that jury right before deliberations, which happened and which was decisive.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think all of those factors make anything Joe writes something I'm definitely interested in reading. And as it's kind of quieted down a little bit in Murdaugh land, which I think is a relief. But this spring and in the fall and winter of next year, things are going to pick back up. We have. Murdaugh's appeal is still ongoing. The state is expected to file their reply by April 10th. And, after that, the record on appeal is going to be filed with the Supreme Court of South Carolina, which in theory should include transcripts, exhibits, anything that they want the Supreme Court to consider as they decide whether or not Murdaugh is entitled to a new trial, if he should get one. And there's a lot of stuff we have not seen yet, a lot of things that the state has not released, including Myra Crosby's dismissal. So it'll be interesting. Joe has been fighting on her behalf to get those files released to the public.
He has.
So I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. We also have Russell Laffitte's second federal trial, as his first conviction was overturned and remanded back to federal court. That'll be starting in, I believe, May. And his first state trial will start in October. So it's, it has been quiet for a minute, but I do think things will pick up.
Let me ask you this. So talking about things picking up, at any point in this process, is the state going to prosecute Becky Hill or Curtis Eddie Smith?
Good question.
Or does that adversely impact their efforts to basically preserve this verdict at all costs?
I mean, at this point, it has been, the roadside shooting was 2021, it's 2025. We are almost at 4 years since the roadside shooting occurred.
It's almost like they're keeping people on ice, isn't it?
Yeah, keeping them on ice. I mean, I did check in with Eddie's attorney, Jarrett Boucher, and there has not been any movement. Eddie is on house arrest in Colleton County. So there's nothing. I mean, there's been nothing.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and if, Eddie kind of waits it out and, gets convicted or pleads guilty, all the time he's on house arrest would be considered credit for time served. So.
Unbelievable. Well, we have said from the beginning that Alec Murdaugh is where he belongs.
Yeah, 100%.
That the punishment he's received is deserved. However, how we get there matters. And if the investigators, prosecutors, and judges whose job it is to seek and uphold justice are more concerned with a verdict protection racket, that's a problem.
100%. I've been really disappointed in some of the things that I've seen tied to this trial. I guess maybe I was naive going into it.
Well, it's the excuse is he's a bad guy.
He's
an
a bad
evil
guy.
guy. And then it's like, well, let's
He
not
is.
worry about, but the problem is, what if it is
Just
you or me, someone we
injustice
love?
for one person is injustice for all. I don't know whose quote that is, but the justice system only works if it works for, like,
Yeah.
And what we saw, that clown show in
Yeah.
Gallatin County, yeah, I have questions, a lot of questions, rightfully so. I think a lot of people do.
Well, we're going to keep the heat on. Joe McCulloch reading his screenplay probably as we speak, but we are going to keep the heat on the state as this process moves forward. And again, for all these true crime stories, updates on the Rose Petal murder, on the John Paul Miller saga, on the Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption saga, keep it tuned to FITSNews. None of these stories are over, and as they move forward, we'll continue to keep you in the loop on the very latest. Jen, thank you.
Thanks, Will.
All right, for our next segment, I'm joined by our Andy Fancher, author of 2 of the highest traffic stories on the website this week. Folks are digging the Badge Gone Bad series, Andy, but you had one this week you've been working on for a long time. We're talking about the investigation into Greenville County Deputy Daryl J. Kicklighter. This is a story you've been focused on for a while. He is the focus, incidentally, of an active and ongoing state law enforcement division or SLED investigation, also an internal review up at the Greenville County Sheriff's Department. Andy, walk us through this story. Who is this guy? Why does it matter?
Sure. So Daryl J. Kicklighter Jr. is yet another example of why we, the public, need to follow our law enforcement officers as closely as we say we follow our politicians. In our last month in review, I spoke on South Carolina sheriffs, specifically ones who have failed their homes, their marriages, their constituencies, or all 3. Now, in that same live segment, I pointed my Tony Soprano finger at their constituency, specifically voters who are blindly following law enforcement, as I did for decades. So I slammed those who blindly support the thick blue line, as well as those who don't even care to monitor the thick blue line. But here we are, 3 days after publishing the receipts that we're about to play, with minimal calls for accountability, and as far as my sources are concerned, no change in the personnel status of Daryl J. Kicklighter Jr.
Let's take a look.
You remember that?
I do
You
remember
stupid.
that.
This is Greenville County Sheriff's Lieutenant J. Kicklighter, now under investigation by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED.
You're calling me a stupid?
You are a stupid.
This recording, captured during a heated exchange with his wife, appears to reference the incident that landed him on administrative duty.
I should have beat
Don't get
you.
in my face.
I should have beat you black and blue for the shit you did to me.
I was black and blue
So when I
that night.
grabbed you around your neck and you said, kill me,
Under investigation for alleged misconduct, Kicklighter was previously accused of adultery. In February of 2024, a private investigator tracked the deputy across multiple locations, documenting what the PI described as a secretive relationship with a married hairdresser. While Kicklighter's county-issued Tahoe was photographed during these rendezvous, it remains unclear as to whether he was on duty.
you remember that?
I do
You
remember
stupid.
that.
As of this recording, he remains employed by the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. For FITSNews.com, I'm Andrew Fancher.
All right, so Andy, you dropped this video, all hell breaks loose.
Right, and usually when we post Badge Gone Bad reports with receipts, there's typically people in the comment section defending a police officer for no other reason than because it's a police officer. Now, something crazy has happened here with Kicklighter because I've searched far and wide and I cannot find one comment in defense of this deputy. Instead, quite the opposite. On Facebook alone, we had upstate photojournalist, internet sensation Malarkey News share our report within minutes of us dropping it, saying, quote, "Zero tolerance for this behavior." And then after I posted the video to my business page on Facebook at Real Andy Fancher, we had the former police chief of Jamestown comment publicly on this matter. Quote, "They, Greenville County Sheriff's Office, will side with him, Kicklighter. The good old boy system is real in South Carolina." This, of course, being the same police chief that contributed to multiple pervert on patrol segments that finally led to the expulsion of Chris Griffin from law enforcement. It only took
him a
us
little bit,
5
didn't it?
installations to get
Took him
there.
a little bit.
But I want to introduce a painkiller, so to speak, to this conversation, because I understand that I'm saying a lot of things that are not palatable. And I'm coming from a position of someone who, again, blindly trusted and feared law enforcement for decades. So what I will say here is that it takes a selfless officer to see a crime within their ranks and actually say something. I have had the privilege to speak with these South Carolina officers, these selfless South Carolina officers, but unfortunately, from what I've deduced, they are few and far between.
Yeah. Well, just if it's taxpayer resources alone going to an extramarital affair, that has been a standard FITSNews has held up for politicians from the beginning. We typically don't write on those affairs, but if you're going to use taxpayer time, taxpayer resources to facilitate a liaison like that, and you're a public servant, someone who is sworn an oath, you got to go. So hopefully, as you mentioned, Hobart Lewis, the sheriff of Greenville County, by most accounts, he's doing a good job, but definitely needs to do the right thing and get this bad apple out of there.
Sure, and I'm not going to picket for anybody's termination. I'm simply going to lay out the facts with context and let the constituency as well as viewers outside of that decide for themselves.
Now, Andy, this wasn't the only bombshell you dropped this week. One of the other huge stories on FITSNews this week, also your work. This is the story of the Irmo, South Carolina mayor pro tem.
Now former.
Oh, you got some updates.
Yes,
The
sir.
sick saga of Eric K. Sickinger. Walk us through this guy. What happened with him, and why is he now the former, as you mentioned, Irmo
Sure.
mayor?
So Eric K. Sickinger, the now former mayor pro tem council member of Irmo Town Council. I have attended council meetings where he was up there beyond the dais. He was charged with, and I'll just pull up the charge record here, 3 counts of criminal sexual conduct with a minor, 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and 1 count of luring or attempting to lure a child earlier this week.
We're told this is an underage boy that is the victim here, obviously not naming names, but
According to the SLED arrest warrants, he appears to have been engaged in a relationship with a 15-year-old, a minor by South Carolina standards. According to agents, he provided the minor with alcohol, with marijuana, and even took him someplace to pay for a tattoo that it appears as though the minor subsequently got. So in the wake of us breaking this story, we had a magistrate set his bond. Well, unfortunately, the news reports are conflicting, and conveniently, his charges have been absolved from the public index. So I don't know exactly what his bond amount was set at, but it appears to be somewhere between $200,000 and $220,000. And while I did not check prior to sitting down with you as to whether or not he has posted his bond, he has resigned from his mayor pro tem under Mayor Bill Danielson. Now, there was a peripheral figure who I had been waiting to enter the proverbial group chat on this one, and that would be Irmo's former mayor, Barry Walker. Now, back when I was working at WIS, I think I interviewed Barry Walker more than any other mayor. He would be right up there with probably Mayor Daniel Rickman and Lexington mayor as well. But nonetheless, Barry Walker lost the election in 2023, which is when Sickinger was appointed as mayor pro tem under the new mayor. So I had been monitoring Barry's Facebook page, and yesterday evening, he dropped what I consider to be a bombshell. So as not to redact or select just key pieces of his post, I just want to read it in its entirety, if that's okay.
go for it.
The situation in the town of Irmo is deeply troubling and raises serious ethical and governance concerns. A sitting council member being arrested for sex crimes involving a minor is already a significant issue, but the fact that the town attorney is representing him while he remains in office only compounds the problem. This creates a clear conflict of interest and undermines public trust in the town's leadership. Thank God Sickinger has resigned. Maybe now we can begin to figure out how this happened and who knew this was going on.
Yeah, that's even a potentially bigger scandal. I mean, not to diminish these horrific allegations, but giving him a taxpayer-funded lawyer for something like this? Who?
And of course, we have not seen the pay stubs, but from what I can tell from open source intelligence, we're the only outlet talking about it. The state did, of course, report the attorney. We've got the former mayor calling on this, and we are now in the process of delving into it as well. I don't know who's paying what, according to the former mayor, is the town's attorney. I don't know if the town's attorney is currently representing Sickinger anymore, as he has now resigned. But this is something that we need to look at and something that we are at this time exploring.
Well, Andy, I got to point out for folks who have not followed FITSNews and have not followed Andy's work, in addition to focusing on corrupt cops across the Palmetto State and holding them to account, Andy, you have also been leading our coverage on these child sex abuse allegations. You were integral in our coverage of the R.J. May saga, which is ongoing. Prominent state representative who is under the focus of a federal investigation related to these types of allegations. There's a bunch of them in South Carolina. This stuff is everywhere in the Palmetto State. The app Kick seems to be the nexus for a ton of this, but there are so many investigations, state, federal. Andy, you've been at the forefront of so many of them, man. Keep it up. Keep us posted not only on what happens with Sickinger, but also if we ever get that accountability up in Greenville County.
Shortly after recording this segment, the town of Irmo provided FITSNews with a letter confirming Sickinger did reach out to an attorney from the law firm representing his town. However, the attorney recused himself from further representation after Sickinger's bond hearing on March 5th, 2025.
All right, so it was a huge week at the South Carolina State House as the issue of lawsuit reform was front and center before the South Carolina Senate. Now, this is an issue that has been debated in South Carolina for many years. I'm joined by Dylan Nolan, who was at the State House this week, covered a huge press conference involving business community leaders, small business leaders, Governor Henry McMaster, Senate President Thomas Alexander, and the man sponsoring the big lawsuit reform bill, Senate Majority Leader Shane Massey. Now, Dylan, this bill has attracted more heat, more energy, more sparring on social media than any piece of legislation that we've covered so far this session. We thought this year was going to be about taxes. We thought it was going to be about school choice, and it has to some extent, but tort reform has been dominating. And tell us just a little bit, when you walked into the State House this week and saw that lobby, had you ever seen the State House lobby as packed as it was this week?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to back it up a little bit. I had to circle the State House for about 15 minutes just looking for a place to park. And, I mean, I used to work over there. I've never had as hard of a time finding parking as I did that day, and that was a precursor to the fact that every square foot of available carpet in that building had somebody's feet standing on it. It was packed.
Yeah. And this is an issue that has driven not only special interests, whether it's insurance industry, lobbyists and supporters on one side, obviously the trial lawyer lobby, we're going to talk about them in a minute, on the other side. But this bill has hit a lot of small businesses, the mom and pops, the restaurant owners, the bar owners, folks who have been forced into an anti-competitive position, the trucking industry, you name it. There's a ton of folks that have been adversely impacted by South Carolina's overly litigious climate, and they showed up in force. So it's a very diverse coalition that's supporting lawsuit reform. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looked like a Village People concert up in the State House that day, because you had folks, wearing the outfits of many different professions. You had a bunch of lawyers there who were against it on the trial lawyer side. You had some insurance brokers who were there advocating for tort reform. But then I would say the vast majority of the people that were there, you had some guys wearing hard hats, construction worker outfits. You had guys from logging companies. You had guys from trucking firms, from the restaurant industry, food and bev industry. So it was a very diverse coalition of people that were there.
Now, Dylan, we've heard from the trial lawyer lobby from the beginning of this debate that this bill Shane Massey introduced, S244, is an insurance industry handout. And certainly there were some provisions in there that were very beneficial to the insurance industry. But when you looked at that coalition, and when you look at the folks who are being adversely impacted by South Carolina's current laws, there are a lot of small businesses. And you talked about some of those trucking companies. Those are small businesses here, homegrown businesses in South Carolina. The bars and the restaurants employ tons of people here in the Palmetto State. They are the ones that are really in need of this reform. The insurance companies are going to survive one way or the other, but it's those small businesses drivers of job creation here in the Palmetto State, those are the ones that really need the help, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think the two things can be true at once. Like this debate has very much so been set up by almost everybody engaged in it as an adversarial relationship between the trial lawyers and the insurance companies. And the insurance companies have been quick to get these business people on their side and say, "Look, we're here trying to help you out against these greedy trial lawyers." Well, I think the reality is if you're somebody trying to operate a business in South Carolina, the trial lawyer industry and the insurance industry are likely taking a big hit out of your pocket. I don't think that it's necessarily the adversarial relationship which folks engaged in this debate have made it out to be.
Yeah.
I think it could be both sides versus the business owner.
No, you're right. Well, we've talked about taxes, but there were two studies that came out in connection with this bill that were referencing a lawsuit tax that is imposed annually on South Carolina families based on these massive premium hikes. Both of those studies found the estimated annual lawsuit tax over $3,000 per family per year. That's a huge hit. And obviously, small businesses bearing an even bigger hit based on the insurance premiums they're being forced to pay. But Dylan, the bill obviously introduced by Senator Massey wasn't perfect. And Senator Massey, to his discredit in the eyes of many, was refusing to compromise one iota, 1 inch on that bill. And so there was a key vote that was held in the state Senate this week, a litmus test vote, if you will, on the bill. Only 19 senators were supportive on that vote, 25 opposed, including 14 Republicans. Now, we're told many of those who opposed it still support a comprehensive tort reform or lawsuit reform bill, just not necessarily this one. So we do think that while this particular battle was lost for Massey, that the broader conflict to fix these tort reform laws is still very much alive. But as we look at the politics of this, Dylan, the trial lawyers pretty much outmaneuvered the business community in their lobbying and strategy on this, didn't they?
Completely. But I mean, as you say, all of those people who are interested in this issue, whose bottom lines are severely impacted by this issue, they're not going anywhere. But yeah, Shade Massey, he was betting big. And what did you and I say to each other back and forth this whole week before the key vote? We'll see if this was a wise gamble, and it ended up not being a wise gamble. And one thing I'd like to talk about is the fact that this bill moved through the subcommittee process, through the committee process, without amendments. You would think that with a bill that, I mean, we all knew that this was going to come to the floor and have a lot of pieces of it that folks were not going to be happy with. And it seems like some of that stuff could have been ironed out earlier. And this was something that I said, okay, I don't really understand why that wasn't done, but we'll see. You know, I trust that a guy who's been in the Senate for years knows what he's doing here, but it seems as though that was not a wise gamble.
All right, so Dylan, while all this was transpiring in the South Carolina Senate, over in the State House of Representatives, there was a bill that was actually passed out of that chamber. But before we get into that, it's important to note that this is a chamber from top to bottom. The leaders are trial lawyers. Merle Smith, the speaker, a trial lawyer. We've got several of the subcommittee and key committee chairs over there, trial lawyers. So this is a chamber that from the very beginning of this debate, the trial lawyer lobby, they knew, hey, if a tough, robust tort reform bill clears the Senate, we've got a firewall here that's at the very least going to be able to significantly weaken whatever comes out of the Senate, or maybe even outright kill it. But the House did pass a bill this week, and it would, in some instances, if certain restaurants and bars jump through certain hoops, like closing at midnight, all these other training requirements, they can lower their premiums from $1 million down to $250,000 as far as what they'd be required to pay out. So it's progress on one level, but once again, it imposes a lot of new government mandates on these businesses, could potentially constrain revenues. So there's a lot of unintended consequences perhaps in that House bill. But as you see that sort of political brinksmanship unfolding, Dylan, how important is the House of Representatives to the trial lawyer lobby as this debate moves forward?
I think that I mean, as you referenced with the leadership being, that's how they make their money. And the reality is that they are also a group that spends a lot of money on elections. So you don't want to cross the trial lawyer lobby lightly if you're somebody who likes to be in office for long.
Yeah, they have stroked a ton of checks. In fact, one of the big revelations this week came from State Senator Tom Fernandez, who on the floor of the Senate basically claimed that he had been bribed or attempted to have been bribed by the trial lawyer lobby with $50,000 to $100,000 in campaign contributions. Fernandez subsequently issued a statement after they gavelled that debate to order and cut the cameras off real quick. Subsequently issued a statement walking that back a good bit. But it is an incredibly wealthy and influential lobby, Dylan Nolan, a ton of power.
Yeah, and I think that the legislation that the House rushed to pass once this failed in the Senate, it's something that will definitely help the restaurant industry, the food and bev industry, and they have been some of the loudest voices for change here. But we referenced the fact that this is an issue that is impacting a lot of different industries in this state. And so this piece of legislation alone, I don't think is going to produce the kind of change that is going to make the truckers, that's going to make the folks building homes, the folks doing all sorts of other, there was manufacturers there. These are all people that the state's legal environment affects. And so changing the amount of insurance that bars and restaurants are required to carry, that's a great start, and it's gonna staunch the bleeding here as far as, we've just heard of VFWs, restaurants, maybe places where selling alcohol isn't the primary source of revenue, so they just don't have the revenue coming in to pay $1 million insurance policy. Think you're the VFW and you're selling a couple cases of beer a weekend to the old guys who are in there shooting pool. You don't have the revenue that, say, a bar on King Street in Charleston does to be able to pay a massive insurance policy, but the geniuses over in the State House had written law saying that you needed to carry a massive insurance policy. So in one way, they're really just undoing their own massive screw-up. But I don't think this issue is going anywhere. Do you have any indication that there's going to be something reintroduced this session, or do you think that we're going to have to wait another cycle of a couple of years to see another crack at the apple here?
Well, I think this has been an awakening for a lot of folks. The trial lawyer lobby, as we were talking earlier, has been very adept at their strategy, their messaging, their lobbying, clearly counting votes better than the majority leader. And I've even heard rumblings his job could be in danger as a result of this screw up. Again, this is a bill he shepherded through the committee and subcommittee process. He set it for special order. And again, it is still pending. They could seek to amend this legislation. And we're told that several of the no votes on Massey's bill, again, still favor something, just maybe not what he's proposing. So I don't think this fight is over this session. And I also think one of the things that we've got to look at, Dylan, looking longer term, and you and I have talked about this on many occasions on this show, about the pernicious influence of these lawyer legislators as it relates to our criminal courts, as it relates to violent criminals being turned out on the street or being released by judges in secret backroom deals with powerful lawyer legislators. Let me ask it to you this way. What do you think is more dangerous to the long-term prosperity of South Carolina? Is it the violent thugs getting let out by these judges with the wink wink from the lawyer legislators, or is it this massive anti-competitive business climate?
I'm a big statistics guy, and statistically, South Carolina's business, man, they've been doing great. We've been booming. We've had a great couple of years. Now, I think that this has as much to do with the rest of the country going completely insane during COVID and just putting, they made a horrific place to do business in most of the country. So southeastern states really benefited from that. If you look at our criminal statistics, we are not doing as well there. We are pretty high on the violent crime list, whether you want to look at murders, unfortunately sexual-related crimes, we're pretty high on those lists as well. So I think that I'm going to have to go with the criminal law.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And the arguments are going to be back and forth over not only the next few months as this issue gets resolved one way or the other in this session, but it has been made clear in the aftermath of this week's vote. I have talked to several folks in the business community who I believe at long last have realized what they are up against. Trial lawyers have been the dominant force in South Carolina politics for decades. They ran the show back when it was nothing but white Democrats at the South Carolina State House in both chambers, white Democrats supermajorities in both chambers. Well, now we've got ostensible Republican supermajorities. Shane Massey thought that was going to be enough to flip the script on the trial lawyers. As of right now, it hasn't been. But that business community, Dylan, may have finally awakened to the threat that they face from that trial lawyer lobby. Dylan, one quick thing before we head out. I know you've been covering this stuff in detail. What were your impressions when you were at the State House, the folks you talked to? In fact, you spoke to one lawmaker, Jay Kilmartin, who is directly impacted by this. What did he have to say, and where does he see this debate going?
So Jay Kilmartin, he was saying he had his head hung low because he had just paid his insurance on his, I think, 3 food and bev industry businesses. And that was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he did very correctly call that Massey had poison-pilled his own bill. He actually gave me that statement on the record. I included it in my article. And, you know, as somebody who's representing his industry, obviously he's representing his constituents at home, but he's also somebody who, one of the few people in the State House with direct experience with this issue from the food and bev perspective. He was looking for something to get done in the Senate, and he was willing to see that bill be amended to make it happen. So I think that he's a great representative. He's a great bellwether for many folks in the business community that don't necessarily need it to be Shane Massey's current iteration of that bill that got brought to debate this week that got killed. But the business community in the state cannot afford for the insurance industry and for the trial lawyers to keep exacting the costs that they are.
Yeah, and I think Kilmartin may actually be representative of some of those senators who are, again, they want something, maybe just not what Massey proposed. In fact, I talked to several of them this week. They indicated that despite this defeat, a decisive political defeat for the Senate Majority Leader, that they believe they're going to get at least half of what they want out of his bill 2404, which for the moment, again, remains up for debate, waiting to be amended. We will continue to track how that plays out. If you haven't already, go to FITSNews.com, folks, for all your State House coverage. We covered a ton of issues this week. This obviously the biggest, but for the very latest, not only on the bills being debated, but the politics that's driving them in the background, go to FITSNews.com. We've always got the inside scoop on those bills. All right, that is a wrap for what I promised was a jam-packed episode of the Week in Review. Before we go, once again, cannot thank all of you who support our work by subscribing to FITSNews.com. Your subscriptions empower everything that we do, whether it's holding folks accountable or diving deep into these issues that the mainstream media either ignores or is biased on. If you want that kind of independent coverage, unapologetic coverage, that's why we're here, folks. So your subscription to FITSNews.com, again, keeps our lights running, empowers everything we do. Thanks for joining us on this week's show. We will catch you next time on the Week in Review.